talked about the history and the wisdom, and tonight we're going to talk about the prophets. So here we are talking about the prophets. All right, and the prophets are our link between Old Testament and New Testament. So hang with me tonight. We're going to talk about the prophets, then I'll have some time to send you into small group. So let's talk about what a prophet is. What is a prophet? You see, I got my, we're going to have several Harry Potter references tonight, but of course the Daily Prophet is the newspaper of the wizarding world. So if I have my Harry Potter folks with me, you know what I'm talking about. A prophet is someone who speaks for God. It is usually a person who tells the people and kings what they're doing wrong and how to fix it. Generally, then, not the most popular person around is a prophet. They're people with imagination. So they inspire hope, but they also give warnings. There's lots of prophets in the Bible. Who can name some in your chat? If I could even see the chat. I can see the chat. Good. Who can name a single prophet from the Bible in your chat? Peter's a disciple, I'll take it. Sure, yeah, I'll accept Moses as a prophet. That's right. He told a lot of people what they were doing wrong multiple times, including the people of Egypt. Who else has got one? It's a pretty broad category. There's a lot of people you could say, and I will accept. But we're struggling now. Elijah, Ezekiel, Jonah. There you go. Jonah said Ezekiel. That's fun. Isaiah, Matthew, sure. Yeah, maybe. Isaiah is definitely a prophet. I see some question marks, which means we also need to spend some time figuring out. You guys get the gist a lot. There are a lot of prophets in the Bible. And I want to clear up a misconception, and hopefully we'll take some time to tease this out a little bit. A prophet is not someone who predicts the future. I know in our modern sense of the word prophet, whenever we use the word prophet, it is someone who, Zechariah, yes, David is a king, but that's okay. Nathan was a prophet who talked to David. So prophet is not someone who predicts the future. They tell people what's wrong in the present. We're going to spend a little time figuring out the difference between those two things, but I want you to go ahead and try to get out of your mind that a prophet's main job is to tell people what's going to happen, because their main job is to tell people what's happened now. Another way to talk about it is they're the people's conscience. Your conscience is that voice in your head when tells you when you mess up that says, oh, you're going to mess up for this. You better not do it. That's what a prophet is, but for the whole people. All right. Let's keep going. So think about it this way. The prophet says, if you don't turn things around, God is going to destroy your city. Now, there's two ways you could think of it. One would be to say, the prophet is predicting God is destroying the city. But that's not the point of what the prophet's saying. It's the turn things around part that the prophet is saying. So the focus should never be on the what's going to happen. It should be on the what is happening now. And we'll talk in just a little bit about messianic prophecies that speak of God's future hope in just a few minutes. I've got another example. Back in September, I started listening to this guy's podcast, Dr. Michael Osterholm, who's a world-renowned virologist talking about COVID-19. And in September, he predicted that by Christmas, we would see over 3,000 dead per day in our country and over 300,000 deaths unless we changed our behavior. So is Dr. Osterholm a prophet? Did he predict the future? Because he got the numbers almost exactly right 3 months ago. Well, it's less important that he got the numbers right 3 months ago than what he was saying about changing your behavior, right? The point isn't this is going to happen. The point he was trying to make is you need to change your behavior now. You need to wear masks and social distance and, not get in big groups and that sort of thing. And that's the kind of difference I want to get into your head about what a prophet is. And that's what a prophet's all about. So let's talk a little bit about what is in the Bible in terms of the prophet books. There's some prophets called the major prophets, and there's prophets called the minor prophets. Now, the major prophets aren't major because they're more important than the minor prophets. Their books are just longer, and they tend to have more universal themes in them. So the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, you might have heard of more of those than this next list. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. If I had have asked anyone in this, was Nahum a book of the Bible before we started, you might have said, that sounds like Pastor Drew made it up. Because most of these books are really short. and pretty specific in the minor prophets. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about the prophets. And actually, Daniel is listed as a prophet, and we'll talk a little about Daniel, but Daniel's probably not the same category as the rest of these books. All right. So what is in these books? We'll run through some major themes of these books and then talk a little bit about messianic prophecies. So the book of Isaiah has two major themes. It is dire warnings mixed with God's hope. Terrible things are going to happen, but God is going to pull you through. Isaiah was written, the funny thing about Isaiah, by about 3 different authors at least, and the content spans hundreds of years. So we know it wasn't just written by one person. It was written over a long time, and so it tells a long story, and it is a long book. And some parts of Isaiah you might recognize are like, unto us a child is born. We'll talk about that. We hear that around Christmas. Isaiah talks about the wolf lying down with the lamb and this vision of hope in God's future. Isaiah talks a lot about what God likes and what God doesn't like. Remember, that's what a prophet does, is point people towards God. And Isaiah points toward Jesus in some interesting ways. Isaiah never names Jesus. None of the prophets ever name Jesus. But the things Isaiah says, talking about a suffering servant, point us toward Jesus. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Jeremiah. My small group leaders might get this joke. I doubt any of the confirmation students will. That's okay. One of the most unique things about Jeremiah is that Jeremiah began to prophesy at a young age. Like a teenager, he would go and tell adults about all the changes they need to make in the world. And he would tell them about upcoming exile. Remember last week, or a couple weeks ago, Vicar Matt talked about exile as like the big story of the Old Testament, that you need to know what happened when the Israelites were forced out of their homeland, because so much of the Old Testament happens in there. Well, Jeremiah prophesied right before that happened, and he said, this is all these bad things are going to happen unless you turn back to God. And so he talked a little about God's judgment on those who aren't loyal. He tried to urge the people to change. Sound familiar? Most of the prophets do that. Lamentations. Lamentations is a book about being sad. It's all about people's sadness because it happened after Jerusalem was destroyed, right? After the people got taken into exile. Again, most of these prophets have to do with exile. And the book of Lamentations is all about God being with you in your grief. It's a affirmation that when things are going really, really bad for you, you can yell at God. You can get angry with God, and that's okay. And if you are angry with God, you should open up the book of Lamentations, because there's some good stuff in there. Ezekiel is another prophet, and Ezekiel is writing after the exile when people felt abandoned by God. How could you have let this happen to us? We got taken away from our homes. And so Ezekiel writes about why bad things happen and people are questioning God. His main image that shows up in a lot of it is the Valley of Dry Bones. This is Dry Bones from Mario Kart. And the Valley of the Dry Bones is when Ezekiel pictures a valley of bones coming back to life. And that's this image of God bringing new life to God's people after terrible things have happened. So a lot of these prophets talk about all the bad things that have happened, but how God's going to bring things back together and bring hope to the world. I told you that the book of Daniel doesn't really fit in the rest of these. Daniel's probably better as wisdom, like Psalms or Proverbs, because Daniel is a book of folk tales and legends. It was written way later than the rest of these prophets, and it's think of it like parables, like stories meant to teach us something else. But the theme of Daniel is that God is with you in frightening times and foreign places. So Daniel isn't really telling the people to turn back to God and change their ways. Daniel's trying to bring comfort to people. And in Daniel, you get some of the best stories in all of the Bible, like the fiery furnace. Anyone remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? That story is in the book of Daniel. You get, of course, the story of the lion's den in the book of Daniel. And you get stories of crazy monsters with horns, all in the book of Daniel. I bet you didn't know that last one, but there is some really trippy stuff in all of these prophets that if you look through them, there's just some crazy characters and horns that talk and beasts that come out of the sea, and it gets pretty sci-fi when you start reading the prophets closely. Speaking of sci-fi, minor prophets. I'm not going to go through everything that's in those 12 books because, frankly, I don't know everything that's in those 12 books, but there's a few things to focus on. The prophet Joel is all about repenting. Again, telling people to turn from their ways and turn toward God. The prophet Amos is all about helping the poor and the oppressed. We'll come back to that in a minute. Of course, you get the story of Jonah and the fish. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Micah writes about what does the Lord require of you? And guess what? It's to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with our God. And so the themes that come up over and over again in the minor prophets are all about justice. I notice you haven't been treating all your people very well. I notice that there are poor among you who you don't lift up and who are still poor. That is what the prophets are generally saying in the minor prophets. So that's a quick overlook at what's in the prophet section of the Bible. And now I want to think about what does any of this have to do with Jesus? Because this is the part where we try to connect the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the prophets are how we do that. So to do that, we're going to talk about what is a messianic prophecy. That is the prophets looking ahead towards a Messiah. And we're going to ask the question, did the prophets then predict Jesus? We said earlier that the prophets really didn't predict things. They talked about God's hope in vague ways. But we look at the prophets and we see Jesus. For example, let's look at Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7. This will probably be familiar to you because we say it almost every Christmas. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David. And if I were to ask you, who is the child? Almost all of your hands should go up, and you could say, that's obvious, Pastor Drew. They're talking about Jesus. We hear it at Christmas time. A child has been born to us. Those are names, Prince of Peace. We equate that to Jesus. I would say, you're right. And I want you to hold on to that thought for just a minute. Now I'm going to get back to Harry Potter. Do I have any Harry Potter fans with us tonight? Because in Harry Potter, if you remember, in book 5, The Order of the Phoenix, there is a messianic prophecy in that book. We learn about. In fact, most of the plot of The Order of the Phoenix is about one prophecy that Professor Trelawney here makes. And she makes a prophecy that a child will come who will challenge the Dark Lord. And in book 5, it's all about that prophecy. And I would ask you, who is that child? You would all say, well, obviously, Pastor Drew, it's Harry Potter. He's the chosen one. He's the one who came to battle the Dark Lord. It's obvious who that prophecy relates to. But have any Harry Potter fans here? You know that that's not the case, don't you? You know that Professor Trelawney's prophecy could have been talking about one of two people. It could have been Harry, but it also could have been Neville Longbottom, right? That's what we learn in book 5, that the prophecy was not specifically about Harry. But what else we learn is that because of how events played out, it must be Harry. From the beginning, when she made the prophecy, it could have been either of them, but Harry is the one who was chosen from there. So Trelawney, when she was making the prophecy, she did not predict that Harry would be the one. She predicted that there would be a one, and because of how things played out, Harry fulfilled the prophecy. You might say it's splitting hairs, but I think that's an important thing to make when we turn back to Jesus and talk about, did the prophets predict Jesus? Because yes, you can look at Isaiah 9, and we do look at Isaiah 9 and say, that is Jesus. But if we were talking about what the prophet was talking about, it could be Jesus or someone else. In fact, there's a lot of scholars who think that Isaiah was talking about a baby named Cyrus, who would become the king of Persia, who would eventually overthrow Babylon and set God's people free. But because of the way events played out, we say as Christians that it was Jesus that Isaiah was talking about. But do you see how that's different from saying the prophet Isaiah predicted Jesus? Instead, we say Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecy. It's like the chicken or egg thing, which came first. And we'll talk about that a little more in just a second, but I want you to just keep that in your mind. It sounds like splitting hairs, but it is important to note that Jesus is fulfilling the prophets, and that's a better word to use than the prophets predicting Jesus. Here's another thing Jesus liked to do, and this is why we say Jesus fulfilled the prophets, is Jesus liked to bring up something that was talked about in the Old Testament prophets and then say, I am that. I am the fulfillment of that. For example, Zechariah 9:9 says, Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey. And if I were to ask you, what's that talking about? You would immediately go, well, obviously, it's talking about Jesus riding a donkey into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. That's an obvious story. But was Zechariah predicting Jesus riding on a donkey? Jesus absolutely knew that Zechariah had written these words. And so Jesus was responding to this. And by him riding a donkey, he was telling people, I'm the one. I'm the one. So you see, there's a little bit of difference that Jesus is responding to the prophet said in order to say, I am the fulfillment of the prophecy. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if the prophets predicted Jesus or if Jesus is fulfilling the prophets. It's the same either way, because Jesus interpreted himself according to the prophets, so do we. And that's why the prophets matter. That's why you need to know this, is because Jesus would come along and say, all those things that the prophets talked about, hope and mercy and peace and love, I am that. Look, I'm riding a donkey. Look, I was a child born. And those things ultimately come together to give us the picture of Jesus. So as Christians, we read the prophets who talk about this coming Messiah, and we look at the life and words of Jesus, and we conclude that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the one they were talking about. But it's also important to know that these prophets are also scripture to our Jewish brothers and sisters, and they read them in a different way. They come to a different conclusion about Jesus. And so that's an important distinction and to at least know in your minds too. I like this text from your study Bibles that says on page 723 in your gray Bible, it says, the prophets reveal God's passion for justice, constant hope for healing, and dedication to restoring wholeness to creation. In Jesus, we find the fulfillment of this hope and the embodiment of the Messiah. So the prophets say something is coming that will change everything. And Jesus comes along and says, that's me. So who are some prophets in our modern world, right? Prophets, if we talk about having the courage to call out a problem when they see it, that's really important there. Let's see here. How can you tell if it's a prophet? You ask, do their words speak about God's love, justice, and mercy, or about themselves? So these are prophets. Some of you may have heard of, some of you haven't. Most of you probably know Martin Luther King, right? A prophet who spoke out against the problems that he saw in the world. The middle guy is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a German pastor who stood up to the Nazis and Hitler. And he wrote about the bad things that they were doing. And so he was calling them out and pointing them towards God's way. The one on the right is Brian Stevenson. He's a lawyer for the Equal Justice Initiative down in Alabama. He takes wrongful convictions, people that were imprisoned falsely, and overturns them and says, this is not fair. And he stands up for those people. So all of these people point to God's love and justice and mercy and not to themselves. And you can think in your small groups about some other prophets that you might be able to think of. All right, let me see if there's anything. All right. Finally, these are some other questions that you can ask in your small group tonight to get you in the mindset of prophets. What is it like when you have bad news to share? What is it like when you have good news to share? What's that feeling when you have something to tell a group of people? When it's bad, you're feeling guilty or whatever. When it's great, you're feeling excited to share it. But that gets you in the mindset of a prophet who had both good and bad news to share. Have you ever noticed something in the world that you feel like you need to speak up about and felt that pull towards doing that? What if the thing that's happening in a community that's wrong is part of a community that you're part of? What if your sports team or your family or your church is doing something that you think is wrong? How hard is it to speak up to those people who you care about? And if you were a prophet, what would your primary message be? What would you be telling people about God? These are some questions that you can bring up in your small group tonight as you delve a little bit more into prophets. So I'm going to send you to small groups in just a minute, but I first want to bring up again some announcements. Something to say, the registration is open. You all received an email about that now. Again, this is how you will fulfill the Strive promise for your confirmation. This is in place of our retreat. It's something you do as a family. Once you register, you get all the information for that weekend. And if you don't register for this event, you will have to do an independent project to fulfill the Strive promise. And so I'd encourage all of you and your families to sign up for Something to Say and be a part of that. It's going to be fun. And it's watching some videos and having some conversations. No student ministry night next week or the week after Christmas. We're taking a couple weeks off around Christmas, and I hope you guys all have an awesome Christmas. I want you to still be thinking about your promises. Hear, love, proclaim, serve, and strive. I'm going to be working on a spreadsheet to try to track these for you that we can share to each other. That's not something I have yet, but it's been a request, so I'm going to try to do that to help you keep track of which promises you've done. My last announcement is for you to start thinking about your Lenten mentors. I know that seems like a long way off, but it's not. I'd like to know who your mentors are by February 2nd. And your mentors, again, are going to be people who are adults who you want to have conversations about faith with that are not your parents. So it can be grandparents, aunts and uncles, family friends, godparents, whoever. I need to know who that person is going to be by February 2nd. If you know now, there was a link in your email today where you can go ahead and tell me who your Lenten mentor is going to be. But I need to make sure you ask them. Don't just tell me their name without asking them. And I need to make sure I have their email address. That's really important too. So Pastor Sarah, you